Welcome back, all you Iced GT gamers. This is Iced GT coming to you live from Southern California. In today's Anthem video, we have got a lot to talk about. I'll touch briefly on the live stream that happened today from the Anthem devs, as well as going over the new information that came out in regards to Javelin gear, the descriptions, and how I think that this is going to affect gameplay. Let's go ahead and get right into it. First up, today's live stream event that happened from the Anthem devs over at Bioware showed an interesting showcase of new gameplay from the Storm and Interceptor Javelins from the Storm's perspective. The Interceptor was decked out in a melee-only build, and while we didn't get to see a whole lot of it, we did get to see its ultimate in action taking out a yellow health barred enemy, which was kind of cool. We also got to see some random world events, and we got to see the Storm's cape working properly, as well as graphics settings set to the maximum like they were supposed to be. I'm looking at you, Paris Games Week. Unfortunately, most of the UI elements were not working properly. They were still in an alpha build, very obviously, so hopefully we'll get to see more of that in the future. They did mention that they were going to be having a separate live stream to go over loot and the loot system in its entirety at a later date. But let's go ahead and get into the important stuff. We're going to start off with the Ranger, its abilities and descriptions. As you all know, the Ranger has a melee ability called the Shock Mace. We've already seen this in gameplay, there's no surprises here. But we now have descriptions for the shoulder gear and the wrist gear, as well as new information in regards to the support gear slot, that oh so elusive third gear slot. First up is the shoulder slot, which is simply titled the grenade slot. There are going to be 5 different types of grenades at launch that the Ranger Javelin is going to have available to it. The frag grenade, which is pretty self-explanatory, it's probably going to be your default area of effect damage that you're going to have available to you at level 1 right as the game launches. Next up, we've got the Inferno grenade, which ignites an area, dealing damage and setting enemies ablaze. Whether or not the actual fire is going to cause any damage over time remains to be seen, but it'll certainly line up your allies or yourself to be able to do some combo damage on enemies that are in that status. Next up is the Frost grenade, which both damages and freezes enemies in place. This is one that we've already seen in the gameplay footage and is going to be a great one for crowd control. Next, we've got Seeker grenades. This is going to be a grenade that splits into smaller submunitions, seeking out the nearest enemy. Finally, we've got the Sticky Bomb, pretty self-explanatory. Attach it to a target, it blows up for a high damage blast. Next up, we've got the wrist slot, which is titled the Assault Launcher. In it, we've got another 5 capabilities at launch, the first of which is the Homing Missile, which is a single missile that seeks out a target and does a small area of effect explosion. Next up is the Energy Pulse, which is a blast of pure energy that hits with incredible force. A Spark Beam, which is a sustained beam of energy for continuous damage. Venom Darts, a volley of darts that'll seek out a single target for acid damage. And the Blast Missile, which is an unguided missile that explodes for AoE damage. My suspicion is that this is going to do more damage than the Homing Missile, as it is unguided. Next up, we've got the Support slot, in which we've got the Bulwark Point, a spherical field which deflects incoming projectiles, and the one we already knew about, which is the Muster Point. Previously, this was going to be an ability cooldown field, but this has recently been changed and is now going to be a weapon damage increase field. Finally, we've got the Ranger's Ultimate, which is the multi-target missile battery. We've seen this many times. It hits a lot of fast-moving enemies and looks amazing. On to the Colossus. We've all seen its melee ability before, but now we have its title. It's called Heavy Smash, and it does a lot of damage. It blows out smaller enemies, and can do a decent amount of damage even to yellow bar enemies. Its shoulder mount is called the Ordnance Launcher. Again, we've got 5 abilities that are going to be available for this at launch, the first of which is the High Explosive Mortar. We've seen this in previous gameplay. This is the single shot mortar that does AoE damage and looks pretty powerful. Next up is the Burst Mortar. Again, we've seen this in gameplay. This is the multi-mortar that does a lot of smaller mortars for the same amount of damage. Third, we've got the Firewall Mortar, which ignites a wall of flame and has actually been seen in gameplay almost off screen in the boss gameplay footage that we saw at EA Play. Next up is the Lightning Coil, which strikes a single random target with an arc of electricity in front of the Colossus and prioritizes targets that already have status effects. This is going to be awesome to be able to maximize your combo damage and allow your allies to really rack up the DPS. Finally, we've got the shock coil, which emits waves of electricity out from the Colossus, damaging all nearby enemies. This sounds like an AoE burst directly at the Colossus itself, and will probably be good for clearing out the small adds that you get when you're getting swarmed. Next up is the wrist-mounted attachment, which is called the Heavy Assault Launcher. The first up on this is the Heavy Cannon, which fires a large rocket in a targeted direction for massive damage. Next, the Flamethrower, which we've seen previously in gameplay footage. Next up is the Flat Cannon. This barrages nearby enemies with a short-range arc of projectiles and sounds very shotgun-esque to me. Fourth is the Railgun, a forceful and precise kinetic round, which we've seen in previous gameplay footage and looks amazing. The fifth ability is called the Acid Spitter, which expels an acid projectile to damage enemies, but no description on whether this is going to be a damage over time or whether this is going to be a single shot. Next in the support slot, we've got a Taunt. A lot of people have been clamoring for this. In a tank class, you gotta have the ability to pull aggro, and this Colossus is no exception. The Taunt ability is going to be able to pull the attack from all enemies within a certain radius to the Colossus. And secondarily, we've got the Deflector Pulse, which is going to give all nearby allies a damage resistance buff. Now, unfortunately, you can't have both the Taunt and the Deflector Pulse, so you are going to have to make that tough choice depending on how you want to play your Colossus. Finally, we've got the Colossus's ultimate, the Siege Cannon. This is your nuke. If timed correctly, you can actually get 3 shots of this massive cannon off to do an unbelievable amount of damage to your enemies. Moving on to the Storm, its melee ability is called the Fiery Strike, which hits with a fire elemental and knocks back enemies. Its shoulder gear slot is actually referred to as Kinesis Gear, and its 5 abilities are as follows. The Lightning Strike, which we've already seen in previous footage, is an AoE lightning attack. Next up is the Ice Storm, which is a field of ice that deals damage, rapidly building to a final explosion of frost. The Flame Burst, a quick fire damage explosion on a targeted location. The Rime Blast, which is a flurry of ice projectiles that damage and freeze close range targets. And the Living Flame, a burst of flame energy that seeks out and ignites targets. This sounds very similar to the Colossus's ability that sends out energy in a radius around from you, but in this case will actually seek out enemies to put them into a fire status. Next up is the wrist slot for the Storm, which are called Focus Seals. The first are the Hoarfrost Shards, rapid-fire shards of ice that slowly freeze targets into place. We've seen this in gameplay already, so let's move on to the next one. A Fireball.
I'm a fireball.
This is a fire ability that can either be fired quickly in small shots or charged up for a larger projectile that explodes. Ball Lightning, an electric energy blast that can be bounced off of walls to reach targets that are behind cover. Fourth is the Glacial Beam, a powerful ice energy beam focused on a targeted location. And finally, the Arc Burst, a blast of lightning that will leap to nearby targets for heavy damage. This ability was actually seen in use in the live stream, and if targeted correctly, can be very effective. I'll put a couple of seconds of gameplay footage of that up here. In the support slot, we've got the Wind Wall, a defensive wall of wind that'll deflect incoming projectiles and was used extensively in today's gameplay footage. I'll go ahead and put stream footage up here of that now. Its secondary ability is called Nexus, which generates a field for gear cooldown reduction. This was previously going to be a ranger ability, but has since been moved over to the Storm. Finally, we've got the Storm's ultimate ability, which is called Elemental Storm. This calls down 3 targeted elemental strikes, one of fire, one of ice, and one of lightning, followed by a meteor strike for each of those. You have a timer during which you'll have time to place the 3 AoE points, and then you hit the trigger to call down the meteors on those 3 spots. Finally, we've got the Interceptor Gear. Its melee ability is called Double-Bladed Daggers, which allows you to do an infinite melee combo. Its shoulder gear slot are called Technique Gear, the first of which is called the Seeker Glaive. This throws a razor-sharp projectile that'll seek out the nearest enemy and damage it. An acid bomb, which is a grenade that splashes all nearby enemies with acid. I was actually the first, I believe, to call this an acid bomb based on the Paris Games Week livestream footage when that was released. Next up, we've got the cryoglaive, a projectile that locks onto a nearby target and freezes it on impact. Cluster mines, which are a group of mines laid in a targeted area and explode on contact with an enemy. And the spark dash. The interceptor dashes forward, leaving behind a trail of electricity that damages enemies in its wake. Its wrist slot are called strike systems. First up is the Star Strike. This charges an enemy with energy and explodes after a short delay. There is a note on this description that says that if the enemy is killed before the delay has ended, the explosion does more damage. This is unclear as to whether that means the explosion is going to be AoE or not. It sounds to me like it is, and I can't wait to use that one in combat. Next is the Plasma Star, a plasma-empowered shuriken for a single target, which is effective at long range. The Nova Strike, which creates a projection of the interceptor, which will attack enemies that it comes in contact with. Based on this description, it sounds like similar abilities in other games where it creates a temporary clone of yourself to do extra damage over time. Fourth, we've got the Tempest Strike, a devastating single-target attack that can stun smaller enemies. And the final strike system is the Corrosive Spray, which sprays a jet of corrosive acid that damages every enemy it hits. The first support ability is called the Target Beacon. This does increased damage on a single enemy, and if you manage to kill that enemy before your target beacon expires, the beacon will automatically seek out the nearest target so that you continue to do increased damage during the duration of the ability. Its second support ability is called Rally Cry. This allows you to remove status effects from all nearby enemies. So if your allies get frozen, are on fire, covered in acid, or some other status, using the Rally Cry will automatically remove this if they're within a certain distance of your interceptor. Finally, we've got the interceptor's ultimate, the Assassin's Blades. This does a series of melee strikes against a number of enemies, or can be used against a single enemy in the case of a boss. Originally, we were told that there was going to be a defensive buff on the interceptor so that it took less damage during this, but in the live stream, one of the developers made a comment that you are actually invulnerable during this ability. I'm looking forward to see whether or not that can actually be confirmed in tweets, and as soon as I have an answer, I'll get back to you guys. Finally, a note on mobility. All four of the Javelins are going to have a damage mitigation capability. Both the Ranger and the Interceptor seem to have some kind of dash to evade. The Storm Javelin has a blink ability, and the Colossus has the retractable shield. All four of the Javelins can jump, although the Interceptor has a double jump. The Storm Javelin has its hover capabilities, during which it deploys a shield. Unfortunately, they recently changed the hover ability, and it is no longer an infinite hover. Recent tweets today confirmed that they determined that this was overpowered and it has been changed so that you can only hover for a certain period of time while your shield is up, or if your shield is knocked out, you will immediately fall out of the sky. That's going to wrap it up for today's Anthem video. If you like this content and want to see more, go ahead and like and subscribe to my channel. If you dislike the content, feel free to leave a dislike below. Also, comment down below. I love to hear your comments, positive or negative. And until next time, this is IceGT, signing off. Have a great night.